Jack Thompson returned to my life like a ghost refusing to stay buried, appearing on a cold, windswept morning outside a forgotten fuel station on Route 17, 10 years after the courthouse plea deal that shattered everything and branded him a traitor. Yet the moment I saw him, thinner, older, eyes hollowed by a decade of running, I knew the stories about him had never told the truth. He stood there trembling, clothes dusty, hands shaking, as if he had forgotten what safety felt like. And when I called his name, he looked at me with a broken mixture of guilt, fear, and the fragile hope of a man who had nowhere left to go, whispering, "They found me, and they'll find you too." A sentence that instantly cracked open the lies I had carried for 10 years. As we drove away from that station, Jack's voice trembled while he revealed that back in 2015, he had uncovered Charles Hargrove's hidden empire, a sophisticated criminal network disguised behind legitimate government contracts. And when Jack threatened to expose the truth, Charles framed him, fed the media a narrative of betrayal, and forced Jack into a plea deal engineered to destroy his credibility forever. Jack told me how he vanished only to keep me alive, how he spent 10 years living out of cheap motels, constantly shifting cities, sleeping with the weight of knowing he had abandoned the only person who once believed in him. And as he spoke, his voice cracked under the heavy loneliness of a decade spent hiding from a shadow he could never outrun. When we reached a roadside motel to rest, the brief silence shattered as black SUVs rolled into the parking lot, men pouring out with weapons drawn, leaving us no choice but to escape through the back window, sprinting into the darkness as gunshots tore through the thin motel walls, the night turning into a frantic maze of back roads and forests until we stumbled upon an abandoned cabin where Jack, pale and shaking, confessed that the USB drive he carried was the last surviving evidence of everything Charles had done. Our moment of calm ended at dawn when Charles' men found the cabin, forcing us back onto the run. And somewhere between the fleeing and the hiding, Jack's resolve hardened. He refused to keep running after 10 years of losing pieces of himself, deciding instead that we must confront Charles head-on. Guided by memories Jack wished he could forget, we reached a rusted industrial complex along the river, a graveyard of dying metal and echoing ghosts, where Charles Hargrove waited with the calm arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Inside the warehouse, Charles smirked as he revealed that he had destroyed the decryption key long ago, mocking Jack for wasting a decade fighting a battle that was rigged from the beginning. And before his words even settled in the air, gunfire erupted, men moving in from the shadows, the metallic clang of bullets filling the cavernous space as Jack fought with the fury born from 10 years of torment, forcing his way through the attackers until finally we chased Charles onto a high steel walkway overlooking the raging river below. Rain hammered the metal, lightning flickering in the distance as Charles taunted Jack one final time, insisting the organization would survive long after they were gone. But Jack, breathing hard, blood mixing with rain, looked at me with the sad, peaceful expression that told me he had already decided his fate. And in a final burst of courage and rage, he grabbed Charles and launched them both off the platform, their bodies swallowed instantly by the violent river. Rescue teams searched for hours, finding only torn pieces of metal and churning water. And the official reports claimed it was an accident involving a wanted man. But I knew better. I knew Jack Thompson died not as the traitor the world believed him to be, but as a man who sacrificed everything to destroy the monster who ruined his life. And now, with the soaked USB drive he protected until his last breath resting in my hands, I carry the weight of his truth and the promise to finish what he started. Because Jack's story didn't end in that river, not as long as I'm alive to bring the world the justice he died for. In the days after Jack vanished beneath the roaring river, the world moved on with a coldness that felt almost deliberate. Reporters recycling the same tired narrative about a disgraced man dying in a criminal accident, while Charles Hargrove was mourned as a respected philanthropist. And I found myself standing alone at the riverbank long after the search teams gave up, watching the restless water that had swallowed the only man who ever tried to save me, gripping the soaked USB drive that felt heavier than any weapon. I returned home with a mind full of ghosts and a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too hollow, as if the walls themselves knew Jack was gone. And for the first time since his return, the full weight of his decade of suffering pressed into my chest, making it impossible to sleep, impossible to breathe, because the world would never know what Jack endured. But I knew, and that truth burned inside me like a wound that refused to heal. I spent hours trying to access the encrypted files on the USB, but every attempt ended the same. Locked screens, corrupted keys, and the mocking realization that Charles had been right about the missing decryption key. Yet giving up was not an option. Not now. Not after Jack carved his redemption in blood and water. So I began digging into Charles's public life. The companies he claimed to own, the foundations he hid behind, and the names that appeared in the shadows around him. Discovering trails that Jack must have followed years ago. Trails that were faint, but not dead. Late one night, as I scanned through Charles's financial patterns, I noticed something strange. Huge, undocumented transfers hidden inside legitimate contracts. A pattern too precise to be accidental. And when I cross-checked dates, I realized these transactions matched the exact years Jack spent running, meaning Charles had been paying to hunt him, funding a silent pursuit through shells and offshore accounts. The discovery lit something inside me, a sharp determination that pushed aside fear, because Jack had carried this mission alone for 10 years, and now it was my turn, my burden, my war. And as I traced the money to a corporate office in Maryland, I understood this was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about dismantling the legacy of the man who destroyed Jack, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of Charles Hargrove but dust. The day I packed my bag and left town, locking my door behind me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, not relief, but the silent acceptance of someone who has chosen a path with no return. And as I stepped onto the empty, early morning road, I whispered the only promise that mattered. Jack, I'm not done, and neither is your story. Then walked toward the truth he died protecting, determined to finish the fight he started and tear apart the empire that stole his life. The next morning felt heavier than it should have, as if the air itself knew Jack Thompson had walked back into my life. I tried to convince myself that yesterday had been nothing more than a strange coincidence, but the truth clung to me like static. He had shown up for a reason. As I made my way through the buzzing newsroom, every sound felt sharper, every glance more suspicious, and the weight of secrets I hadn't thought about in years pressed behind my ribs. When my editor called me into his office, I expected a lecture about deadlines, not the icy shock of seeing a manila file on his desk stamped with the letters I had hoped I'd never see again, DOJ. He slid it toward me with a look that wasn't a suggestion but an order. There was a new investigation opening, one involving the same financial networks that had destroyed Jack a decade ago. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My editor thought he was giving me a story. He had no idea he was handing me back the ghost I had spent 10 years burying. As I walked out with the file tucked under my arm, the hallway seemed to tilt, and it hit me with a sickening certainty. Jack hadn't just returned from nowhere. He had returned because something was starting again, something bigger, darker, and unfinished. And now I was being dragged into it, whether I wanted to be or not. I didn't plan on seeing Jack again so soon, but fate or whatever cruel force was steering this mess had other intentions. That evening, as I stepped out of the subway and cut through the narrow alley behind my building, a shadow peeled away from the wall, and before my pulse even steadied, I heard his voice, low and familiar enough to freeze me in place. Jack stepped into the glow of the street lamp. The same worn leather jacket, the same guarded eyes, as if the last 10 years had been compressed into a single breath. He didn't apologize for ambushing me, didn't pretend this was some nostalgic reunion. Instead, he looked at the folder in my hand, the DOJ crest peeking from the inside, and his jaw tightened like he already knew what it meant. He told me I needed to stop digging, that this investigation wasn't just dangerous, it was the same network that had framed him, the same people who had made him disappear in 2015. And they hadn't forgotten either of us. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to demand the truth he never gave me. But before I could speak, a car rolled down the alley with its headlights blacked out, and Jack grabbed my hand, pulling me behind the dumpster just seconds before a bullet cracked against the brick where my head had been. My heart hammered as the car sped off, and Jack's grip didn't loosen. In that moment, with smoke curling from the wall and fear clawing its way up my throat, I realized two things with chilling clarity. Jack wasn't lying this time, and whatever he was running from had finally found us. We didn't speak until we reached my apartment, both of us still breathing hard, both pretending that the hallway lights and locked doors meant safety when we already knew they didn't. Jack paced like a hunted animal while I bolted the door, triple-checking it even though it wouldn't stop the kind of people who shot at us. When I finally faced him, he was running a hand through his hair, that old restless habit I used to tease him about, except now it looked less like nervous energy and more like a man trying to hold himself together. He told me the network that framed him wasn't just some rogue group or forgotten operation. This was a multi-million-dollar laundering chain stitched into federal contracts, corporate security firms, and two politicians whose names alone could bury anyone who dared to speak them out loud. He said the plea deal he took wasn't a choice, it was survival, because the moment he tried to expose the truth, they threatened me, and disappearing had been the only way to keep me alive. Hearing that felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me, because for 10 years, I carried the weight of betrayal, the anger, the endings I thought he chose. And now, all of it shifted so violently that I didn't know whether to scream or collapse. Jack stepped closer, softer now, telling me that my recent investigation had triggered old sensors, that the same people watching him were now watching me, and that the attacker in the alley was only the first warning. I wanted to reject all of it, to accuse him of spinning another story. But the fear in his eyes wasn't the fear of a liar. It was the fear of a man who knew the clock had already started counting down. I asked him what we were supposed to do now, and he said the only thing we could, run before they erased us for good. We didn't pack much, there wasn't time, and Jack insisted that anything traceable had to stay behind, which meant my phone, my laptop, even the jacket with my office key card in the pocket, all of it abandoned on the kitchen counter, like artifacts from a life that had ended without warning. Jack moved with a precision that came from years of running, checking the windows, scanning the parking lot below, guiding me down the back stairwell instead of the elevator, his hand lightly gripping my wrist as though he was afraid I'd vanish if he let go. The city felt different that night, louder somehow, every car engine sounding like a threat, every passing shadow a possible gunman. And though I told myself I wasn't someone who panicked easily, my heartbeat kept stuttering every time Jack tensed at something only he seemed to notice. We reached a dusty sedan he claimed was clean, and as soon as we pulled onto the highway, he began explaining how deeply the corruption ran, how the laundering network was tied to private prisons, offshore accounts, falsified procurement reports, and a web of contractors who operated like ghosts. No fingerprints, no digital trail, only money and violence to keep their empire intact. He said they had eyes everywhere, in agencies, in police departments, in the software that tracked phone pings and facial recognition hits, meaning that once my name appeared on their radar, I became a variable they needed to eliminate. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Not only had my life changed overnight, but so had the rules of reality. The institutions I grew up believing in weren't just compromised, they were weaponized. Jack kept glancing at me like he expected me to hate him for pulling me into this storm. But all I could feel was a raw, electric determination burning through the fear. Because now that I finally knew the truth, running wasn't just about survival. It was about refusing to let the people who ruined him do the same to me. By dawn, we had crossed 2 state lines, the sky shifting from black to a pale bruised blue that made the world look tired and half-finished. And Jack finally pulled off the interstate into an abandoned rest stop hidden behind a curtain of overgrown trees. He killed the engine, and for a moment we just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant hum of early morning traffic, both of us too drained to speak. When he finally did talk, his voice was low and rough, explaining that we needed someone he could trust, someone who owed him. But the way his jaw tightened made it clear trust was a currency he'd run out of long before I found him again. He told me about a former analyst named Mara Delaney, a woman who vanished from the contractor scene years ago after refusing to falsify surveillance logs tied to the same laundering network that destroyed his life. Rumor had it she lived off-grid now, bartering intel for safety, and if anyone still had evidence capable of tearing the whole operation open, it was her. The weight of what he was saying settled over me slowly. We weren't just running anymore. We were hunting. And the moment we made that choice, we stopped being witnesses and became threats. I felt fear coil in my stomach, but underneath it was something sharper, a sense of purpose I hadn't realized was growing every mile we drove. And when Jack asked if I was sure I wanted to keep going, I didn't hesitate. Because after everything they'd taken from both of us, turning back wasn't an option. He gave a small haunted nod as if he'd expected me to fold, then reached under the seat and pulled out a map marked with coordinates, tapping a point in the wilderness where Mara was last seen. As we merged back onto the highway, the sun finally broke over the trees, casting long shadows across the worn asphalt. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I sensed that we were no longer moving blindly. There was a direction now, a target, and a fragile thread of hope woven into the danger ahead. The road to Mara Delaney's last known hideout was a narrow stretch of cracked pavement that eventually dissolved into dirt, the kind of path that didn't show up on GPS and seemed to grow narrower with every mile, as though the forest itself were swallowing it. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and sunlight flickered through the trees in stuttering flashes that made everything feel unreal, like we were slipping into a place time no longer bothered to measure. Jack drove with both hands tense on the wheel, his eyes sweeping between the road, the mirrors, and the tree line. And though he didn't say it, I could feel the unspoken dread radiating off him. If Mara had truly gone off-grid, it wasn't because she feared the law. It was because she feared something far worse. We stopped when the path finally disappeared altogether, and after parking behind a fallen log, we continued on foot, following a faint trail that snaked deeper into the woods. The air grew colder as we walked, the silence heavy enough to press against your ears, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional snap of a distant branch that made Jack's hand drift toward the weapon tucked at his waistband. When we reached the clearing, it appeared so suddenly it almost startled me. A single cabin, weather-beaten and leaning slightly to one side, its windows boarded and its roof patched with mismatched scraps of metal. Jack motioned for me to stay behind him as he approached the door, which was reinforced with more locks than some bank vaults. And before he could knock, a voice from inside commanded us to step back and raise our hands. The door opened only a sliver at first, revealing one sharp, pale eye, then widened just enough to let a woman step into view. Mara, gaunt and ghost-like, her hair chopped unevenly, a rifle held steady despite the tremor in her hands. She recognized Jack instantly, her expression flickering from shock to fury to something like resignation. And after a long moment, she jerked her head for us to enter, warning that we'd been followed for at least 10 miles. Panic surged up my spine, but Jack stayed calm, guiding me inside the dim, cluttered cabin full of papers, hard drives, maps, and equipment that buzzed with low static. Mara locked the door behind us and began flipping switches on a jamming device that filled the room with a soft, pulsing hum. then turned to us with a tired, haunted look that said she'd spent years waiting for this day. The day when running was no longer enough, and the truth she carried would finally drag her back into the war she tried so desperately to escape. Mara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She moved with the jittery precision of someone who lived too long in the crosshairs, sweeping aside stacks of documents until she uncovered a metal case secured with 3 different locks, each one clicking open with a tension that made my pulse spike. Inside were hard drives, flash cartridges, and notebooks packed with handwriting so dense it looked like static. And when she dropped them onto the table, the thud seemed to shake the entire cabin. She explained that years ago, before she disappeared, she's been assigned to analyze discrepancies in contractor invoices tied to a cluster of shell companies. And instead of a simple accounting glitch, she uncovered an international laundering pipeline masked behind classified defense projects. The deeper she dug, the more she found fabricated identities, ghost employees, manipulated prison statistics, staged raids, political donations funneled through offshore trusts, and at the center of it all were 2 men whose public reputations were spotless, but whose private operations were soaked in blood. Jack leaned forward, listening like every word was a countdown, while Mara pulled up grainy surveillance clips, encrypted message logs, and a fragment of a voice recording that made my stomach twist because the man speaking in it wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. Mara said the network needed Jack gone because he'd stumbled into a shipment trace that could expose an entire arm of their operation. And once he refused to alter the logs, they pinned the blame on him and used a plea deal as a leash. When she turned to me, her stare cut straight through me as she said my investigation into the old financial report had accidentally reactivated dormant monitoring flags, alerting the network that someone close to Jack was looking into the same fractures he once found. Her voice shook as she told us that the group following us wasn't a cleanup team. They were an eradication unit, the kind sent only when loose ends become liabilities too dangerous to leave alive. Jack asked if the evidence in her possession was enough to destroy the organization, but Mara laughed, a dry, bitter sound, saying that exposing the truth wasn't the challenge. Surviving long enough to deliver it was. Then she paused, glancing to the window, her expression tightening as she whispered that sensors she'd planted outside the perimeter had just gone dark, one by one. In that moment, everything inside the cabin shifted. The air, the silence, the fear. As Mara killed the lights and motioned for us to get down, her voice barely a breath as she said the 6 words that sent chills slicing straight through my spine. They found us, and they're close. The first gunshot shattered the window before Mara even finished speaking, spraying glass across the cabin floor as Jack pulled me down and dragged me behind an overturned table, the echo of the blast ricocheting through the cramped room with a violence that felt almost physical. Mara moved like instinct, switching on the backup jammers and grabbing a second rifle from beneath a stack of files, her breath sharp and controlled as she peered through a slit in the boarded wall to count how many shadows moved between the trees. She whispered that there were at least 6, maybe more, advancing in a formation too disciplined to be anything but the network's elite strike unit, the kind sent only when an erasure needed to be absolute. Jack's jaw tightened as he loaded his weapon, telling me that once they breached the cabin, we'd have seconds, maybe less, to escape or fight. And though fear surged through every vein in my body, something inside me hardened, refusing to let 10 years of lies and ruin end in this forgotten patch of woods. Another shot cracked through the night, followed by the crunch of boots closing in, and Morrow hissed that they weren't trying to storm the cabin, they were tightening the perimeter to trap us. She yanked open a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug, revealing a narrow tunnel reinforced with metal plating and tangled wires, explaining that it led to an old storm drain half a mile north. Jack urged me down first, his hand warm on my back as gunmen began shouting orders outside, their voices cold and practiced. And as Mara tossed the metal case of evidence into Jack's arms before climbing in after us, she muttered that if the network captured any of us alive, everything we'd fought for would vanish with us. The tunnel was damp and claustrophobic, each step echoing with distant thuds that could have been roots, or gunfire, or our own pounding hearts. And when we finally emerged into the overgrown drain, dawn was just beginning to break, casting the forest in a dim silver glow. We sprinted through the underbrush, branches slashing our arms as the sound of the cabin exploding behind us shook the earth, the shockwave knocking me to my knees while Jack hauled me back up, shouting that we couldn't stop. By the time we reached the clearing where an old rusted truck waited, one Mara had hidden years earlier, we were bleeding, exhausted, and trembling, but alive. As Jack started the engine and Mara watched the tree line for movement, I looked back at the smoke rising above the trees, realizing that the life I once knew was gone forever, replaced by a war we never asked for, but were now bound to finish. And as the truck rattled onto the dirt road and sunlight finally washed over us, I understood with a clarity sharp enough to hurt that survival wasn't the victory, exposing the truth was. And whatever waited on the other side of this fight, we were going to face it together. The truck rattled down the desolate back road with a sick, uneven rhythm, the engine coughing like it might die at any moment. But none of us dared suggest stopping because the forest behind us still glowed faintly with the smoke of the exploded cabin, and every instinct I had screamed that if we slowed down, even for a second, the people hunting us would close the distance. Mara sat in the back seat, pale and trembling, clutching the metal case like it contained her last heartbeat, while Jack kept one hand on the wheel and the other curled around the weapon resting against his thigh, his eyes scanning the mirror so obsessively I could see the reflection of the trees warping under the tension. My mind raced with the same question over and over. How far would this go? How many shadows were trailing us? How long until the network decided to deploy something even deadlier than the strike unit we had barely escaped? And the longer I asked it, the more the answer settled into something cold and unshakable. They wouldn't stop until every one of us was erased. When the truck sputtered and jerked violently, Jack cursed under his breath, managing to wrestle it onto a narrow service road before the engine finally gave out with a wheezing groan, leaving us stranded in a stretch of wilderness so empty it felt like the world had ended. Mara immediately climbed out and began scanning the horizon with a small analog scope she pulled from her jacket, muttering that our window was shrinking. At best, we had an hour before someone found the trail, and at worst, they were already circling us from a direction we couldn't see. Jack kicked the tire in frustration, then turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on him before, an uneasy mixture of fear and resolve, saying we had only one real option left: reach a safe house run by a former intelligence contact who owed him a life debt, a man so deeply buried in the off-grid underworld that even the network hesitated to cross him. The safe house was miles away, accessible only through a series of abandoned logging paths that were nearly impossible to navigate without being spotted, and every part of me wanted to tell Jack this was insanity, but the truth was we had no alternatives anymore. We were past the point of plans and deep into survival. So we grabbed what little we could carry, leaving the truck as a decoy, and headed into the dense stretch of woods on foot, each step sinking into damp earth, each sound magnified into something sharp enough to prick at my nerves. The forest grew darker the deeper we went, shadows stretching between the trees like warnings, and though none of us said it out loud, we all felt the same thing, the sensation of being watched, hunted, tracked by something unseen but closing in with every passing second. And as we pushed forward, breathless and determined, the realization hit me that this chapter of our escape was no longer just about reaching safety. It was about finding out whether truth was powerful enough to outrun the kind of darkness that had spent years mastering the art of disappearing people like us without leaving a trace. The deeper we moved into the forest, the more the world around us seemed to fold into itself, the trees growing taller and closer together until their branches knitted into a canopy that swallowed most of the daylight, leaving only thin, shifting strands of light to guide our path. Every sound felt amplified: the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant echo of something moving with intent behind us, and though Mara insisted she could tell the difference between an animal and a trained tracker, the tightness in her voice betrayed how uncertain she truly was. Jack walked ahead, cutting a path through the undergrowth with a focus so intense it bordered on desperation. His shoulders tense, his breath steady but far from calm, and every few minutes he paused to listen, his entire body sharpening like a blade. I followed close behind, clutching the strap of my bag until my fingers ached, trying to breathe quietly, trying not to picture the strike unit emerging from the shadows at any moment. Mara brought up the rear, constantly checking a small handheld receiver connected to a web of frequencies she had mapped years ago. Her brow furrowed as she muttered about scrambled signals and interference spikes that only occurred when sophisticated tracking arrays were nearby. The forest terrain grew harsher, jagged rocks, steep inclines, tangled roots, and more than once I slipped, only for Jack to catch my arm and push me onward, his voice low and urgent as he reminded me that stopping, even for a second, could mean the difference between living and vanishing. After nearly an hour of relentless trekking, Mara stopped abruptly, her expression shifting from fear to something colder, more calculating. She had detected a faint directional sweep in the static, an electronic pulse searching for us, and she knew instantly that the network was deploying a long-range scout drone, the kind designed to identify heat signatures through dense terrain. We had minutes, maybe less, before it pinpointed our location. Jack scanned the area, his gaze landing on a narrow fissure in the earth, partially hidden by a fallen tree, and without hesitation he motioned for us to crawl inside. The space was tight, damp, and smelled of moss and rotting leaves, but it was deep enough to conceal our bodies from an aerial scan, and as we squeezed into the natural crevice, our breaths mingled in the darkness, shallow and tense. The faint buzz of the drone approached, its mechanical whine drifting through the branches like an angry insect searching for prey. And for the longest 30 seconds of my life, I didn't dare move, didn't dare blink, afraid even the slightest exhale would betray us. Mara kept her hand on the receiver, watching the erratic frequency pattern stabilize as the drone passed overhead, its scanning beam sweeping dangerously close before veering off toward the direction of the abandoned truck we'd left behind. Only when the sound faded did Jack signal for us to move again, whispering that the safe house couldn't be more than an hour away if we cut through the ridge. Dangerous terrain, but necessary now that the drone had narrowed the search radius. As we climbed out of the crevice and resumed our march through the shadow-thick forest, I realized something had shifted within all of us. Fear was still there, sharp as ever, but beneath it pulsed a new, fierce determination. We weren't just running anymore. We were surviving with purpose, pushing toward a place where truth might finally have a chance to breathe. If only we could stay ahead of the darkness hunting us through the trees. The forest thinned just enough for us to glimpse the ridge ahead, an enormous spine of rock rising from the earth like the back of some ancient creature, and Jack warned that crossing it would be the hardest part of the journey, not because of the climb itself, but because the terrain was too exposed, too open, the kind of place where a single pair of eyes or a single thermal scan could end everything. Mara adjusted the strap of the metal case slung across her shoulder, her movements sluggish now, fatigue clinging to her like a second skin, yet she refused to let Jack carry it, insisting that if anyone should risk being slowed down, it should be her, since the evidence inside was her burden as much as it was our hope. The ridge loomed larger with each step, jagged stone cutting through the fading afternoon light, and as we reached the base, Jack scanned the horizon one more time, his muscles coiled with tension as he caught a flicker of movement far behind us, too distant to identify, too steady to ignore. We began the ascent, fingers digging into cold rock, boots slipping against loose gravel, breath growing harsher with each pull upward, and by the time we reached the halfway point, my arms trembled so violently I could barely keep my grip. Jack noticed and moved beside me, guiding my hand to a more secure hold, murmuring that we were almost there, even though his own voice wavered with exhaustion, and for a moment, the terror inside me softened into something else. Trust. fragile and desperate. At the top, the world opened before us in the sweeping view of valleys and dense stretches of forest. And for the first time since we fled the cabin, I felt the faintest pang of awe. But it vanished instantly when Mara dropped to her knees and pointed toward the horizon. A thin trail of dust rose along a distant access road, illuminated by the low orange sun. A convoy moving fast, too aligned, too coordinated. Unmistakably a tactical unit. They had found the truck. They had followed the drone signal. And now they were closing the final gap. Jack pulled me down behind a boulder as Mara crawled beside us, her breath quick and sharp, whispering that we needed to descend the other side immediately and take the ravine path that would lead straight to the safe house. But the descent was worse than the climb, steeper, slick with damp moss, the kind of drop where one misstep meant broken bones or worse. And yet, we had no choice. We began sliding and climbing down the uneven rock, clinging to roots, branches, anything that kept us from plummeting, all while the distant rumble of engines grew louder, vibrating faintly through the ridge, as though the mountain itself felt the danger approaching. A rock gave way beneath my boot, sending me stumbling forward, but Jack caught me by the backpack strap, pulling me upright with a grunt of pain that told me his shoulder had taken the strain. Still, he pushed me onward without hesitation. By the time we reached the bottom, my legs felt like liquid, and Mara was wheezing, pressing a hand to her ribs as she pointed to a narrow slit between two slabs of stone where the ravine path began. Jack guided us inside, the shadow swallowing us whole. And as we moved deeper into the cold, echoing channel carved by centuries of rainwater, I realized the truth in Mara's shaken voice. We were now only minutes ahead of a force designed to erase entire lives without leaving a body behind. And as the ravine curved sharply and darkness enveloped us, one thought carved itself into my mind with brutal clarity. The safe house wasn't just our destination anymore. It was the final line between us and a disappearance so complete the world would never even know we were gone. The night felt unnaturally quiet as Jack and Mia stepped out of the abandoned facility, the desert winds sweeping dust around their feet, while their minds raced with the truth they had uncovered. But neither had time to process it because the distant growl of the engines suddenly echoed across the sand, headlights slicing through the darkness as three black SUVs advanced toward them, like predators closing in, forcing Jack to grab Mia's wrist and pull her behind an old water tower just as bullets shattered the silence, punching into metal and sending sparks through the air. Mia's breath trembled against his shoulder, her heart pounding. But Jack whispered for her to stay low as he returned fire using the weapon he had taken earlier. And for a moment, the world turned into flashing muzzle fire and flying sand, until both of them ducked deeper behind the structure, knowing they were outnumbered and almost out of ammunition. But then Mia noticed a strange flicker in the distance, a solitary drone hovering with a blinking blue light. And before she could warn Jack, the drone projected a hologram of a man's face into the darkness. A face Jack recognized instantly. Dr. Keaton, the man he thought had died 7 years ago. The man responsible for the experiments that ruined so many lives, now alive and speaking with a calmness that chilled both of them as he said, "You've gone far enough, Jack. The truth you're chasing belongs to me." And the moment his voice faded, the drone launched a blinding flash that overloaded their vision and left them disoriented, allowing the armed men to close in until Jack grabbed Mia and ran toward the cliffs, half blind but guided by instinct, dragging her into a narrow canyon just seconds before the SUVs erupted in a fiery explosion behind them as the drone detonated above, shaking the earth beneath their feet. And as the dust thickened around them, Mia collapsed onto the rocks, staring at Jack with tear-filled eyes and asking why Dr. Keaton would still be alive or why he called the truth his. But Jack only stared back, shaken and pale, because the voice had triggered a memory he had buried for years, something he had never told Mia, something that could destroy everything between them. And as he finally whispered, "Mia, I think Keaton isn't after the files. He's after me." She froze, realizing this was no longer just a fight for justice, but a war built around Jack's past. And before she could speak, another shadow emerged at the top of the canyon, watching them silently, signaling that this nightmare was far from over. The shadow above the canyon didn't move at first, just stood there like a carved silhouette against the moonlit sky. But when Jack raised his weapon, the figure descended slowly, hands lifted in surrender, and Mia's breath caught when the person stepped into the light. Elena Ward, Jack's former partner, the woman everyone believed had died in the fire 70 years ago, her face hardened by scars and survival, her eyes sharp with the same intelligence and betrayal that once tore their team apart. As she approached, Jack's entire body tensed, torn between shock, anger, and the guilt he had carried since the night she vanished. But Elena simply said, "If you want to survive the next hour, you'll come with me," forcing Jack and Mia to follow her deeper into the canyon as the echo of distant reinforcements grew louder. Once hidden in a narrow cavern, Elena revealed that Dr. Keaton never died and had rebuilt the program underground, using their past missions, Jack's data, and even their personal mistakes to fuel his new agenda. And Mia felt a cold realization settle in her chest when Elena added that Jack wasn't just a target, he was the key, the only successful subject whose mind had developed an unpredictable immunity to Keaton's neural experiments. A detail Jack himself had never known because Elena had been ordered to keep it from him, which made Mia stare at Jack with a painful mixture of fear and heartbreak as she whispered, "What else don't you know about yourself?" And Jack, shaken, confessed that he'd been having flashes, bursts of memories, voices, visions he couldn't explain, moments that now seemed less like trauma and more like something implanted long ago. But before they could unravel the truth, the sound of drones descended like a storm, forcing Elena to shove them toward a hidden exit tunnel, shouting that she would delay the attackers. And as Jack grabbed her arm, refusing to leave her again, Elena looked at him with the weight of 1,000 regrets and said, "Jack, I never betrayed you. I was trying to save you," before slamming the metal gate behind them, trapping herself outside with the incoming mercenaries. Mia and Jack sprinted through the narrow passage as gunfire echoed behind them, their breaths sharp and uneven, until they emerged onto a steep ridge overlooking a deserted road where a single motorcycle waited with its engine still warm as if someone had left it for them. And as Jack mounted it, with Mia holding tightly around his waist, he felt the weight of Elena's sacrifice and the rising terror of what Keaton planned, driving them into the darkness with only one certainty left. Nothing about his past, his memories, or himself could be trusted anymore. The motorcycle tore through the empty desert highway, its engine roaring against the silence of the night as Jack pushed it harder than it was ever meant to go, the cold wind cutting across his face while Mia held onto him so tightly he could feel her heartbeat pounding against his back. And neither of them spoke because the weight of Elena's sacrifice hung between them like a ghost riding alongside them. When the first hints of dawn colored the horizon, Jack veered off the main road and into an abandoned rest station, skidding to a stop behind a crumbling concrete wall, where they finally caught their breath, and Mia, still shaking, demanded to know what the visions were that Jack kept denying, forcing him to admit that he'd been seeing Keaton's face in flashes of memory he shouldn't have, hearing coded phrases and languages he didn't speak, and worse, recognizing places he had no recollection of ever visiting, which made Mia's eyes widen with horror as she realized Jack wasn't just a survivor of Keaton's experiments, but a living part of them. Before the truth could settle, Jack noticed movement behind a shattered window. No gunmen, no drones, just a dusty terminal still faintly glowing with power, as if someone had recently used it. And when Jack booted it up, the screen flickered and revealed a live message waiting specifically for him, a video of Keaton himself sitting in a sterile white room, smiling with the unsettling confidence of someone who knew he was several steps ahead, telling Jack that Elena's reappearance was expected, her sacrifice predictable, and that everything Jack believed he was escaping had only pushed him further into the maze Keaton designed years ago. Jack's jaw clenched as Keaton explained that Jack's immunity wasn't an accident, but the result of a failed attempt to overwrite his mind, one that made Jack the only subject capable of resisting neural control, which now made him the most dangerous threat to the program and the most valuable asset if captured.
and Mia felt a chill rush through her when Keaton leaned closer into the camera and stated that Jack's visions would get stronger, more violent, until the memories he'd been hiding from himself clawed their way back into the light. The screen then shifted to live drone footage of the canyon they had escaped, showing mercenaries loading bodies into armored trucks, Elena's among them. And Mia covered her mouth, tears breaking as Jack stared in numb silence, his hands trembling with fury and grief he couldn't contain. But Keaton wasn't finished, revealing coordinates displayed on screen, warning Jack that if he didn't come willingly within 24 hours, Mia would be taken in his place. And before the message ended, Keaton offered a final chilling line. "You can't outrun what you are, Jack. You can only return to it." The video shut down, leaving Jack and Mia in the suffocating stillness of the ruined station, and Mia grabbed his shaking hands, insisting they would fight, run, do anything except surrender. But Jack, staring at the coordinates burning on the screen, felt something inside him shift, an old instinct awakening, a buried piece of himself rising, and he whispered that maybe the only way to end this was to walk straight into the storm, even if it meant destroying everything he thought he was, to finally learn the truth.
The air felt heavier as Jack and Mia approached the coordinates, a remote industrial complex buried deep in the outskirts, where rusted metal towers pierced the sky like broken bones. And Jack rode in silence, every mile tightening the coil inside him as memories flickered like broken film. Sounds, orders, flashes of light, a cold metal table. None complete, all haunting. When they finally reached a ridge overlooking the compound, Mia slid off the bike and stared at the sprawling maze of warehouses, security towers, and armored vehicles below, her voice trembling as she whispered that this place felt wrong. And Jack agreed, feeling an eerie familiarity settle into his bones, as if he had walked these grounds long before tonight. They crept forward, using the shadows to cover their descent, but halfway down the hill, Jack suddenly froze, grabbing Mia and pulling her behind a rock as a convoy rolled out. Rows of black trucks, escorted by gunmen in matte helmets, their gear too familiar, their formation perfect, and Jack's heart sank because he recognized it instinctively, not from memory, but from muscle, from training he never remembered receiving. Mia watched him with growing dread as Jack unconsciously mirrored the guard's movements, his body recalling patterns his mind didn't understand. And when she asked softly what was happening to him, Jack could only whisper, "I've been here before." But the realization shook him so deeply, he had to force himself to breathe. As the convoy moved on, Jack and Mia slipped into the compound through a drainage pipe that led into a dim maintenance corridor. And every step Jack took felt like walking through an echo of a life he never remembered living, his hands skimming walls that felt too familiar, his heart reacting before his mind did. And then they reached a sealed door with a biometric pad that hummed faintly. And without thinking, Jack pressed his palm to it. Mia tried to stop him, but the pad blinked green instantly, unlocking with a soft mechanical hiss as if it had been waiting for him. Mia stared in horror, but Jack said nothing, unable to explain why the door recognized him. And inside they found a long, sterile hallway lined with glass rooms, each filled with equipment that looked like a twisted marriage between medical tech and military hardware. Machines humming with quiet menace. And Mia's breath faltered when she saw empty restraints on operating tables, signs of recent use, and the chilling silence of a facility built not for healing, but for control. They reached the final room, a massive chamber with a single raised platform in the center, and the lights snapped on the moment Jack stepped inside, blinding white and clinical. And then the loudspeaker crackled to life with Keaton's calm voice welcoming Jack home. Mia grabbed Jack's arm, urging him to run, but the exit sealed shut with heavy locks as Keaton's voice echoed through the room, explaining that Jack wasn't just a survivor, but the prototype, the first mind that resisted the reprogramming process, the anomaly he had spent 10 years trying to replicate. Jack felt the floor tilt under him as the truth crashed over him. He wasn't just hunted, he was the blueprint, the origin, the reason this entire facility existed. And when Keaton finally stepped out from behind a glass wall in a pristine white coat, smiling with a mixture of triumph and twisted affection, Jack felt a cold fire ignite inside him, the beginning of something darker, stronger, and more dangerous than anything he had known before. As Keaton whispered through the intercom, "Welcome back, Jack.
It's time you remembered who you were meant to be. Jack stepped toward Keaton with a calmness that felt foreign even to him, a quiet strength rising inside him like a tide finally returning home. And Mia gripped his arm for a heartbeat before he whispered that he wasn't walking into a trap, he was stepping into the truth that had been stolen from him. Keaton watched him with unsettling fascination, circling the platform as he explained that Jack was never meant to escape the program, that his immunity made him the perfect weapon, and that tonight he would finish what he started years ago. But Jack felt something shift inside his mind, a door unlocking, memories rushing back not as pain but as clarity, his training, his resistance, his promise to Elena, and the moment he decided he would rather die than become Keaton's tool. As Keaton activated the neurosystem, bright lines of energy flickered around the chamber, but unlike before, Jack didn't collapse. He stood taller, stronger, his immunity no longer a flaw, but a shield fueled by his memories, his choices, and Mia's faith in him. And when Keaton saw the system failing, panic cracked through his composure for the first time. Jack seized the moment, ripping open a panel and overloading the core as alarms blared across the facility, and Mia sprinted to his side, helping him disable the final locks until the entire chamber shook violently, sparks showering the floor while Keaton staggered back, shouting that Jack didn't understand what he was destroying. But Jack looked him in the eyes with a calm resolve and said, "I'm not yours anymore." The explosion ripped through the platform, sending Keaton crashing backward as Jack and Mia dove into a side corridor, sprinting through collapsing halls as fire roared behind them, and they burst out into the night just as the entire facility detonated in a massive shockwave, lighting the sky like a sunrise of flames. Jack fell to his knees, gasping, Mia wrapping her arms around him as debris rained in the distance, and for the first time in years, Jack felt free. No voices, no visions, no commands, only silence, only breath, only life. Mia pressed her forehead to his as sunrise broke over the horizon, warm and soft, and Jack realized that he had finally reclaimed not only his past, but his future. And the two of them walked away from the smoking ruins together, knowing they had won not because they survived, but because they chose their own path at last. 6 months later, the world felt quieter, cleaner, almost unfamiliar as Jack stood on the wooden porch of a small lakeside cabin surrounded by tall pines, swaying gently in the breeze, a place far from laboratories, drones, and haunting memories. And Mia stepped out beside him, carrying 2 steamy mugs of coffee, smiling in that way that made everything inside him settle. The sun shimmered across the calm water as birds scattered overhead, and Jack breathed deeply for the first time in years, feeling the peaceful weight of a life finally lived on his own terms. The government investigation had cleared him of all wrongdoing, Elena's files had exposed Keaton's crimes to the world, and the program had been dismantled forever, its remaining survivors given new identities and new beginnings, something Jack himself was finally learning to accept. He still had flashes sometimes, echoes of what he had been, but Mia always reminded him that memories did not define him, choices did. And he held on to those words every day. As Mia leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, Jack wrapped an arm around her and watched the lake ripple softly under the morning light, a peaceful simplicity he never thought he would know again. When Mia whispered that they should consider staying here permanently, Jack felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a sense of home he had long forgotten existed, and he nodded with quiet certainty, knowing he didn't need anything more than this moment, this peace, this future they had fought so hard to reach. And as the sun rose higher, painting the sky with soft gold, Jack realized that he wasn't running anymore, wasn't afraid anymore. He was finally free, finally whole, and with Mia beside him, he stepped into the day ahead with a heart unburdened and a future wide open.